Good evening and welcome to our virtual IMC 2020 Fringe event, an interview and Q&A with Professor Steven Vanderputten on the following topic: how to tell the story of Western monasticism's medieval past in the 21st century. Thank you all for joining. Before we begin, please beware that this event is being recorded and that we might use the recording later on for social media purposes. Do you want to introduce Steven Vanderputten, Julia?
Yes, are we ready? Yes, okay. Steven Vanderputten is Professor of Medieval History at the University of Ghent, and he has published widely on the subject of religious groups and their development, social embedding, and culture. Tonight's topic is inspired by one of his recent publications, which we had the pleasure to publish at the Greuter. I will quickly share the screen so you can see the book. Here we go. This is the book, Medieval Monasticism, Form and Experiences of the Monastic Life in the Latin West. Let me stop the shared screen. We, that is Robert Forke and myself, Julia Schöbeck, both work at the Medieval Studies editorial department at the Greuter, and we are very pleased to moderate tonight's event.
Yes, and we will start with a short interview, and we'll then open up the discussion to the audience. Feel free to use the Q&A function, the Zoom Q&A function, already during the interview if you have any questions, and we'll get back to them once the floor is opened for the discussion. Let's start.
Okay, so let's start. When we set out preparing this event, you told us that writing your book on medieval monasticism proved to be unexpectedly challenging. Could you maybe tell us why that is?
Well, let me first thank you for inviting me for this interview, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight and to have such a large audience, I see. Well, to answer your question, unexpectedly challenging, why? Well, because I wanted in this book to give students and other readers, early career researchers and so on, an idea of the current state of the field. And what I saw was a discrepancy between what I could read in most of the major handbooks which were published up until the end of the 20th century, actually, and what's been studied in the last 25 years. The course of the debates, the topics that have been looked at, the methodologies that have been used. So I didn't really expect to find that I would have to read lots and lots of case studies just to puzzle together what people have been looking at in a specific field, or people working on a specific period, or people working on a specific region. So that's why it's been quite daunting. The book includes a bibliography of about 700 titles. Originally, I was told I could include 300 titles. I've read about 3,000. And maybe for the next edition, we'll include all of them if we can.
Okay, yeah, that is a challenge for sure. If I might jump in here and ask you in a nutshell, how has the history of medieval monasticism been told in the past, and why was this an inaccurate representation?
Well, inaccurate. What I wanted to do in this book is to give an idea of where we currently stand. So there is an element of progressive insight, obviously, and I don't want to disparage the major surveys and the major synthetic handbooks of the last century and even longer than that. So I would recommend anyone interested in the history of medieval monasticism to read the handbook by Lawrence, to read David Knowles, to read all these big names from the past. However, as I said, I wanted to represent where we currently stand in the discussion. And what strikes me is that there is, as I said, a discrepancy between how the story of monasticism used to be told as a sort of a sequence of dominant models or movements, which would then fit into a narrative of a sort of narrative cycle of charismatic origins, blossoming and then decline. And also a second narrative approach, which was to represent each of these movements as more or less homogeneous. Benedictine monasticism, or Carolingian monasticism, Cluniac monasticism, the Cistercians, the Mendicants, and so on and so on. And I think based on what we've done, or what the scholarly community has been doing in the last quarter century, we need to nuance that. We can't just say, first you have Egyptian monasticism, then you have Columbanian monasticism, Benedictine monasticism, Frankish monasticism, Cluny, Gorse, English Benedictine Reform, Cistercians, Mendicants, and then we end up with the semi-religious movements of the late Middle Ages and observant reform. You have to take into account the coexistence of multiple forms and experiences in each of these stages. And that is something which I wanted to highlight in this handbook.
Right, and sort of, you know, we're talking about this huge transformation, and but so what were sort of the developments that brought in new perspectives to, you know, our idea of monasticism's past, and also in connection to that, were these developments really specific to the study of medieval monasticism, or like broader in nature?
Well, certainly broader in nature if you look at the diversification and the change of thematic interests. People have been integrating questions about gender, about space, about all kinds of new subjects, integrating new subjects into the discussion. There's been a lot more interdisciplinarity also, which has completely changed the way we tell the story of monasticism. And then secondly, there has also been a growing amount of interest really over the last couple of decades in understanding how the story of monasticism has been told actually since late antiquity. Since the 3rd, 4th and 5th centuries, people have been telling the story of where monasticism, how monasticism originated, how it developed. And you have different chapters in that story, or different stories, sequential stories, so to speak. And each of these has been informed by, you know, the ideological context in which they originated, the institutional context, maybe the cultural context. And what you see is that scholars have become interested in understanding those backgrounds of those stories. So understanding why all of a sudden people found it important to say monasticism originated in the Egyptian desert. Understand it to say why Benedictine monasticism was in the early Middle Ages the pinnacle of monastic achievement, and so on and so on. So this attention in understanding storytelling really, and I don't want to use this in a pejorative way, but just saying how have we constructed a linear narrative of the monastic past, is really what has impacted quite heavily on the field.
That's really interesting also in
oh yeah, and to answer your to answer your question, is it specific to medieval monasticism? Well, no, it isn't. You see it, these arguments featuring quite heavily in discussions about late antique monasticism, and obviously also for the period after the Middle Ages, early modern period and modern period, you see basically the same thing in different publications, unfortunately.
Yeah, so it's really fascinating to hear about all this diversity. But however, when retelling the history of the medieval monasticisms in your book, you have chosen to follow quite a linear order in your chapters. Could you maybe elaborate a bit on this decision?
Yes, that was quite deliberate. So it took me a long time to decide how I was going to, you know, organize my book. And then I decided I'm going to find a sort of a middle ground between telling a sort of an almost radical new story and, you know, inserting myself in a very modest way, actually, in a succession of synthetic arguments about the monastic past. I wanted to make clear how for each of the classic chapters in the old story, there have been new arguments based on new empirical research, collaborative research also, and that actually forced me to say, well, let's begin in Egypt and let's see what's actually true of that old story, how we can nuance it, and to what extent it still holds up or doesn't hold up, and so on and so on. So it's a bit of a risky exercise. I acknowledge that, but then, you know, life is there to take risks.
Yes, for sure. So we have been talking a lot about the discrepancy between the past and the current state of the research. It might be a peculiar question, but would you dare to make predictions? What narratives might change in the future? And why do you think these narratives will change?
So when the book was published and I first looked at the finished product, I said, oh God, I've told a story of diversity whilst using this old structure. And it was quite deliberate, but afterwards I said, this has been a huge mistake, but maybe it hasn't been, but maybe in 5 or 10 years, someone will come up with the right way of, you know, finding a new narrative structure without completely demolishing the old one, but showing how it developed over time. But I feel we are still in a transitional phase. So the book kind of reflects that, I think.
And sort of, this is also a little bit of a more personal perspective, because I recently visited a large exhibition on medieval nuns in Zurich at the Landesmuseum, and so therefore I really know that, you know, visitors today, they flock to such exhibitions, but also to former and current monasteries. And in your view, sort of, what motivates our current modern day fascination with these monastic experiences that you're describing in your book?
Well, for some people, there is an element of familiarity with the Christian heritage from, you know, their own faith group in which they were educated, for instance, or because they live near a monastery, or because they were taught about it at school or something like that, or they read about it. So there is an element of familiarity. At the same time, and you especially see that with students, with younger people, it's a completely alien world. Alien in a sense that they often have no idea what it's, you know, what it's about, what monasticism is about, but also alien to their own experience. And there is also always a fascination in that which is completely alien to what you experience yourself. What is kind of interesting is when I give talks to the general audience, the wider public, they seem to have an idea about medieval monasticism, which isn't actually based, and you can't blame them for that, in knowledge or in a deep understanding of what medieval monasticism actually is, but is based on later accounts of medieval monasticism, especially 18th and 19th century ones. It's sometimes disorienting for people when I say, well, these great monasteries we talk about, you know, these great monastic movements, for instance, we talk about, they're really quite diverse, and you have to see them in their own context and this and that. And sometimes people are a bit disoriented by that. And that's, I think, the role of the academic, the scholar, so to speak, to, you know, look at certainties or things we think are certainties and say, but I think it's a bit different. And then that's based on my research.
I think that is a very good note to open the discussion on. So to all the attendees, if you have a question for Professor Vanderputten, please write it down in the Q&As. We will then proceed to read them out loud, and we will try to unmute the person who asked it. This gives you the opportunity to rephrase it or to add any missing comments and to engage more directly in the discussion, of course, if you wish to do so. Okay. I see a raised hand, so I'll unmute you, Christopher. Does that work?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
You can hear me. Excellent. Yes, and hello, everybody. I myself, my PhD is focused on a monastery, so this talk is this interview is of great interest to me. My question basically comes from a rather personal angle, to be honest. My father has been very skeptical of the value of monastic history. In fact, he's quite skeptical of monks in general. Really, kind of.
Well,
yeah, I suppose kind of thinks that they're kind of very self-absorbed and divorced from the rest of the world. That they don't develop the same sorts of skills that ordinary people do. But I think since his recent travails in his physical health, he's come to recognize the value in a lot of the therapies and lifestyles that options offered by people from a monastic angle. I myself live not too far from the Buddhist monastery of Conishead Priory, which is itself quite. It's quite remarkable just how there's been ever since the Buddhist monks came to Conishead, there's been a sort of flowering of alternative therapies and alternative lifestyles and medicines that are quite at odds with Western established medical conventions.
Yeah.
It really got me thinking. Really, have we lost something in our modern desire to try to render a secular understanding to not just monastic history, but I suppose history in general? And how does that and what does that tell us about our relationship, not just to the past, but also to ourselves and our own bodies? In other words, as far as this topic is concerned, by pursuing a critical investigation of the history of Western monasticism, can it help us to understand some of the root causes of many of our physical and mental health afflictions, using Western monasticism as a sort of
inspiration?
Mm.
Yeah, that is a very deep question. It would take a couple of hours to answer that properly, I think. It's as a scholar, in first place, I want to understand why monasticism made sense to people living in the past. Monasticism made sense in what I want to say is that I want to understand why it is a continuous presence in the Western world and, you know, outside of the Western world also throughout the last 2 millennia. And so why it makes sense to people, how to interact with that phenomenon, why it continues to exist, what are the factors that allow it to continue to exist. Whether the causes of that is that people find some kind of inspiration in it, that may be part of the answer, but that is not necessarily the entire answer, and is almost certainly, or is certainly not the entire answer. So I don't know if I'm in the right position to give a full answer to that. Certainly what you see is that a lot of people at this moment are quite interested in an idea of what monasticism represents and how it allows them to take some distance from, you know, their daily concerns or the way in which modern society has been looking at the human body and has been, treating the human body in general. The question is, does that reflect a medieval reality? Does that reflect medieval attitudes or just past monastic attitudes? Or does that reflect how outside observers, especially from the modern and contemporary periods, have been imagining how medieval people and monastic people in general treated the body? That's a kind of a difficult question, and which there's been very little research on that. And you might answer to that, well, do we need, you know, academic research to answer that? And I think the answer is probably yes. We need to understand where these ideas people currently have, people are looking for spiritual solutions today, where their view and vision of monastic life actually comes from. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but yeah.
Oh, that is absolutely. In fact, I might hasten to add that modern society might be more open to understanding medieval monasticism, having lived a semi-monastic life for the past 4 months in some circumstances.
Yes, maybe. Well, so certainly we've been practicing social distancing at a worldwide scale, so it's quite interesting to see how if we will have any residual trauma or deep inspiration from that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Emilia was interested in sort of the aspect of interdisciplinarity and what it brings, what adds to current research. And Professor Vanderputten, could you maybe elaborate on that? Or Emilia, maybe you, hopefully you are in the process of being.
Yes, can you hear me?
Oh, hello, Emilia.
Yeah, hello. Yes, I know. I think I know that in some ways working on that book, as you recently published, has its own frustrations in a sense, because you sit basically on a very high tree, and you see all these past and present historians running around and writing about monasticism, and they only, we all as these little historians tend to see things from relatively narrow perspective. Only if you climb such a big tree you start seeing why the landscape, also in the sense you see where people don't talk to each other in an extremely frustrating way, don't read each other, they don't communicate across languages and so on. And in the context of that, could you say a bit more, what do you think is the role of interdisciplinarity, in particular in relation to history of Western monasticism? In what way interdisciplinarity can help us ask different questions about medieval monasticism?
Oh, thank you, Emilia. You raise several points, actually. And as you stated at the beginning of your remark or question, I think, and I know we share the same opinion on this, I think specialists of medieval monasticism, you know, people working on different eras, different regions, and so on, should talk more to each other. And what I've very much noticed is that people independently from each other, probably driven forward by cultural developments in the 21st century, are talking about intersectionality, are talking about, you know, gender, are talking about bottom-up processes of identity formation and such like. And it's all like they've invented the wheel separately from each other. And that's not to be disparaging, but it is kind of interesting to see, if you're working on the 15th century, that people who are working on the 8th century, completely different contexts, are asking the same questions, are looking at things from a very similar perspective. I think that would be a major step forward. So if we have more conferences, more publications, more workshops, more conferences that look at things on a very broad chronological scale, I think it's possible, even or despite all the, you know, contextual differences, institutional differences, and so on and so on. Interdisciplinarity certainly also plays a role in that. One really cool example is you know, historians collaborating with digital humanities specialists, deep mining of large text databases and all of that. There is a lot of information to be gained from that. That is just one example. I think we also can move forward quite a bit still in collaborating with archaeologists, especially archaeologists who, you know, work on the evolution of the landscape, archaeologists who work on soil composition and stuff like that, things I know nothing about, but then you have, there's probably a scholar out there who might be able to help me. Certainly, you know, if you're working on boundaries, for instance, why not work together with a geographer? Why not work together with a social geographer? Especially, why not work together with people who are interested in economic processes on a macro scale, and so on and so on. I think there is a lot to be gained from that. But as you know, it's hard, obviously, you know, bringing together an interest, a specific interest in, you know, a specific monastic subject, and I'm going to a geographer and saying, I want to work together with you. There is often quite a cognitive distance, let's say it nicely, between how these people look at research and how we look at research, obviously. Is that an answer to your question, Emilia?
Yes, absolutely, it is. If I could ask a little follow-up questions, have you found your ways to bridge this cognitive difference in approaching? Do you have yourself positive experiences in that area?
I have, but it's why I mentioned the possibility of working together with digital humanities specialists. I'm now looking at working with graph databases. It's very complicated. I'm absolutely not equipped to do that, but apparently, you know, there are people out there, IT specialists out there, who are willing to help me find my way into that deep and dark world of IT stuff, and actually help me to enrich my methodology as a traditionally trained historian. And I find that heartening. I find that really, really fun. 10 years ago, you would have an IT person coming in and say, you don't understand what I'm doing. And now you actually have someone who can help you move forward with your own questions, with your own research. I think there is a convergence happening, and that's quite reassuring in a way. But we have a long way to go, I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Emilia.
Great. So, and then Molly Green posted a question in the Q&A section about sort of the 18th and 19th century narratives and their influence of our idea of monasticism. Hopefully we can unmute Molly and wait, yeah. Molly, do you want to add something to that?
I'm not hearing anything.
So otherwise I'll just, let's see. So the question that she formulated was, could you say more about the narrative of the 18th and 19th century vis-a-vis medieval monasticism? You have mentioned that this is a narrative that the general public has today or is influenced by today. And what did the 18th and 19th century commentators get wrong?
Well, what did they get wrong? How did they? So as a scholar, I'm not there to say this is right and this is wrong. I'm there to observe how people have been constructing an image of the medieval past. And obviously, similar to what was happening in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, people try to make sense of a very complex, very diverse history in a way that somehow fits, you know, how they see the world, or matches how they see the world, how they see the development of the past, or the development of human society, and so on, the development of religious experiences and the place of religious and spiritual experience within the human experience in general. As regards the 19th century, there's a big influence, and it's vastly underestimated, I think, from various revolutionary and counter-revolutionary movements. There's also a big influence from novelistic literature, which has had a major influence. I think there's actually the previous commentator, Emilia Jablosiak, is working on that, so you should probably ask her. But I think in terms of, I've been reading, for instance, just to give you an example, I've been reading a lot of sentimental French novels from the 19th century about canonesses and nuns. And it's kind of striking to see that a lot of prejudices you find in early 20th and mid 20th century historiography, serious studies about the place of female monasticism in the religious landscape of the Middle Ages, really match what you find in these novels. And obviously these novels are also inspired by elements of, you know, historiography, but also, you know, the imagination that runs wild with, you know, how people perceived the medieval past, and even how pre-revolutionary women religious themselves imagined their medieval ancestors. It's a huge field. If you look quite closely at the literature from the last 20-25 years, and if you go to a lot of conferences about monasticism, it's quite striking to see that 1 out of 2 scholars who talk about monasticism start off by talking for 10 minutes about how people have been looking at the monastic past in the 18th and 19th century, because it's become completely unavoidable to talk about this, you know, with some exceptions, or in some fields it has been discussed so much that you don't really need to dwell on it much longer. But if you want to talk, for instance, about 10th century reform, you have to refer at some point to 19th century authors. Why these French, you know, authors from the mid-19th century talked about reform in a specific way, and how that ties in with societal developments happening at that particular point in time. There should be lots of books about perceptions in different countries, in different societal and cultural contexts of the medieval monastic past in the 17th, 18th and 19th century. So I invite all of you to start working on that.
Great. I think before we continue with the question, Manu Radhakrishnan had her hand up for quite a while. Manu, do you want to wait, so I think ask your question. I think she's still muted, you, Julia. Manu Radhakrishnan.
You should.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I'm actually a he. Manu in India
sorry.
is a man's name. Not that it matters, but I know that in Germany in particular, Manu is short for Manuela. But anyway, I have two questions. I see from the contents that you mentioned Cenobitisms and monasticisms, and I wondered whether you have any treatment of eremitical movements, because that word doesn't appear in the index. That's the first question. The second question is, I see that the place where you seem to explicitly address geographical variety is in chapter 2, because you mentioned Southern Gaul, Italy, Iberia, Irish, Iro-Frankish, but then after that it seems to be more thematic. So can you please, since obviously I haven't read the book yet, but simply looking at the list of contents, could you answer the question as posed, because this is all I can see at the moment?
Yeah. Eremitism is all over the book. It's in every chapter. So at the beginning of the book, I say my definition of monasticism is a working definition. Because we don't really have a standard definition of monasticism, we have a standard, more or less a standard definition of cenobitism, but monasticism can be, if you look at the literature from the last 25 years, it can be any kind of ascetic lifestyle within the Christian tradition. So you can have lay people who basically pursue a monastic lifestyle while remaining in the world by being chaste, by devoting their life to prayer, and so on, care for the sick and needy. So eremitism certainly belongs in that spectrum, so to speak, going from, cloistered life in a cenobitical context to, on the other side of the spectrum, lay people who practice certain monastic behaviors. And within that spectrum, you certainly have eremitism. So there's a lot of attention to eremitism. As for your second question about geographical, so that was a question, wasn't it? About
yes.
Yes. It's also in every chapter of the book, actually. The focus of the titles are inspired by the classic way we've been telling the story of medieval monasticism. The classic way for the earliest medieval period and late antiquity is to differentiate on a geographical level, to say you have monasticism in Gaul, you have monasticism in Italy, in Iberia, and then for later periods it becomes more of a general story, Cluniac monasticism in general, the Cistercians in general. However, if you look, and I would invite you to read the book if you care to do so, in the book itself, in the narrative itself, it's all over the place. I heavily emphasize the need to take into consideration geographical and even geophysical variations within the physical landscape, but also certainly in the religious landscape, and how these variations shape also forms and experiences of the monastic life. So it's definitely not absent in the book itself.
Thank you.
Great. So, and then there was another question by Dorothy Africa. Julia, could you see if you could unmute her so that she might be able to pose a question in person if she wants to? It's about early women's communities and early women's community in Ireland and
yes.
the sources.
Mm-hmm.
Dorothy, do you want to say something about it?
You should be able to unmute yourself on your screen.
Can you hear me at this point? Yes, thank you. Much, I think Professor Vanderputten has commented on much of this already in one way or another, but I was wondering what in, say, the 5th or the 6th century in Ireland, it seems that their principal source of information is coming from North Africa, John Cassian, the Desert Fathers, that sort of thing. I was wondering if he was able to offer some kinds of written manuals or sources that it's clear from what little information we have in the Saints' Lives that these women were desperate for information. Of course, the lives are written after the time, but I do think they reflect a continuing problem. Christianity is such a doctrinal thing. If you wanted to lead a religious life, finding out how that was done seems to have been a major problem for the places that were primarily rural on the fringes of the West. And I wondered if, from his vast experience, the professor could comment a bit on those problems.
Past experience, I wouldn't say. Well, let me answer that in a very general way. What you see in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, of course, we don't have many sources, and that's a problem. We don't have many manuscripts, especially for women's communities, where we can say this particular manuscript was used, or this particular text was read in a women's community. We have a number of wonderful exceptions, but of course, for a lot of communities, we don't have anything. We don't have any concrete information, or maybe a saint's life that does reflect some elements, but are hard, elements of real life experiences, but are hard to verify, obviously. Now, if you look at things from a very high perspective, so if you try to have a sort of a bird's eye perspective on things, what we see is an immense hunger in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages for texts, inspirational texts for the monastic life. Let me make the comparison with Iberia, regions that now belong to northern Spain. You have fantastic material on which most of the publications are in Spanish, so a lot of people who speak other languages aren't aware of those. But we have lots of indications that there is an immense hunger by even tiny communities to gather as much as possible all kinds of texts coming from all kinds of different inspirations. We all see the same in Gaul in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. People are really eager to gather as many texts as possible, and preferably texts that come from very different backgrounds and have very different perspectives on the monastic life. This element of comparative reading and inspirational reading is something which I highlight in several chapters of the book, where I say we need to, if we find a manuscript, if you find evidence, for instance, that Irish women in this early period were reading John Cassian, does that mean that they molded their life to reflect John Cassian's idea? Well, not necessarily, but they certainly were interested in knowing about his opinion. So there's very quickly, surprisingly quickly, there is an idea in communities all over the Western world about who are the big names in monastic literature, and would we like a copy of that? Well, the answer was probably yes. If they could obtain a copy, they probably would have tried to obtain a copy. If that is an answer to your question. You're muted, by the way.
Yes, thank you very much.
Leonie Hicks has also asked sort of, again, a question on sort of what should we focus right now at this moment, like scholars of monasticism. Leonie, I hope we can, yes, I think you should be able to unmute yourself now. Do you want to add something to your question?
Yes, you answered it in part. It was a sort of question that followed on from Amelia's point about interdisciplinarity, and you answered it in part in relation to Molly's question. But yes, I just sort of wondered where you think we should be focusing our efforts at the moment as scholars of monasticism.
It's not up to me to say, Leonie. We should probably, but what strikes me is that a lot of people who, watch the news quite keenly, who read other stuff than just studies about medieval monasticism, somehow they all seem to move in a similar direction. It's culture driving us forward, to explore certain thematic interests. And the fact that so many people are working on space, the fact that so many people are working on identity narratives in the early 21st century, surely it tells us something about our culture on a transnational scale. But my advice to students mostly is just do whatever you want to do. Whatever you can set your heart on, just do that. And probably it's going to reflect in some way, or tell us in some way something about all of us. It's like, as you know, Leonie, I've done a lot of work on reform, I think, and a lot of people are doing a lot of work on reform in recent decades. Surely it tells us something about how we think about institutions, how we think about societal development today. And sometimes that's implicit, and some people manage to connect that to current developments in society. And it's not up to all of us, or not all of us, and certainly I am not equipped to always say exactly why we are doing this or that. But intuitively we are moving towards certain subjects, and certainly even if I knew where we would be moving, I wouldn't say it, because it's not up to me to dictate where we should be heading. Definitely not up to me.
I think you're too modest, but thank you. And I think you're absolutely right that we need to examine in more detail those early modern attitudes to medieval monasticism and how that shaped our field.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Also,
so thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Lena.
So there was another hand up, I think, in the chat, right? So Stefan Bohn from Kiel, I think.
Yeah, hi everyone. Can you hear me?
Not anymore.
Oh, he was unmuted. I think, Julia, did he unmute it? Oh, yeah, I think now it should work.
Does it now work?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. I have a question concerning the societal dimension of medieval monasticism. I mean, the old master narrative saw monasticism as largely removed from the wider society, regarding the wider world only in the form of lay patrons and so on, when in fact it was not. And I was wondering, how can this broader perspective actually be integrated in the old master narrative?
Well, economic historians have been doing that for many, many decades, obviously, because they are interested, especially for the early Middle Ages, they've been doing that all the time, because the monasteries, well, some of them still tend to view monasteries as big landowners that dominate the organization of the rural landscape, and so on and so on. But if you think about it, and it's something I mentioned earlier on, just the fact that monasticism existed for such a long time, it couldn't have been sustained if there wasn't any connection to society. It is a societal phenomenon. Monasticism is definitely a religious and a spiritual phenomenon, but it is also a societal phenomenon. It's quite straightforward. It's an institutional phenomenon in many ways, but it's more than that. It's an economic phenomenon, it's a social phenomenon, it's an ideological phenomenon. It belongs to society. There is no way of separating monasticism from the rest of society, and we shouldn't do that. It doesn't make any sense. It's there, people experience it. So when I try to explain that to students, and sometimes they say, oh, we're not going to talk about, these totally, people who have no connection whatsoever to society. They do, because they belong to society. They are a part of society. And it's not a qualitative argument. It's just they're there in medieval society, so we should be studying them. I sometimes get, get the reproach that I'm studying an elite group. It's not an elite group. It's part of the social fabric. And it's not a judgment about whether that's good or bad. It's just there. And it's my job as a historian to study stuff that was there in the past.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So,
unfortunately,
yeah, I guess, right? Our time is pretty much up, right? Julian?
So, well, we are not even slowly anymore. We are approaching the end of today's event. And first of all, Professor Vanderputten, thank you very much for taking the time to tell us about your fascinating work. And to all the attendees, thank you for your interest and the lively discussion. And if you have any further questions, you can get in touch with us via email. I'll just show you our email contacts.
Right. And there are a few more questions that we weren't able to answer. We will, I think we should be able to show them to Professor Vanderputten, but if you really want them, if you want to start a conversation, possibly do write him or do write us. We can forward the question as well.
By all means, and let me take the opportunity by thanking you for your interest in this conversation and maybe in the book, and also by thanking the Mr. Falk and Mrs. Sjöberg for their help with organizing this interview.
It was an absolute pleasure. Okay.
Okay. So again, thank you to all of you, and have a nice evening or a nice rest of the day, depending on your time zone.
And enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.